The expulsion of humanity from the Galactic Council of Sovereign Civilizations in year 5114 of the Common Reckoning was, at the time, considered by most of the Council's member species to be one of the cleanest and most justified governance decisions the body had made in its 400-year history. The vote was not close. 27 species voted in favor of expulsion. 4 abstained. 2 voted against. Humanity's own seat was, of course, vacant by the time the final tally was read. The Council's presiding officer had suspended the Terran Assembly's participation rights 48 hours earlier, pending the expulsion vote, which was the protocol, and which meant that the species being expelled was not present to hear the decision announced. This detail was noted at the time as procedurally correct and by a number of delegates as additionally appropriate. Some things the prevailing mood suggested did not require an audience. The record of what humanity had done to earn this expulsion is not, in this account, the central subject. The record is available in the Council's public archive and is extensively documented, and the historian who has examined it thoroughly, as this one has, arrives at a view that is more complicated than the vote suggests, and less comfortable for both sides than either tends to acknowledge. What is relevant for this account is the shape of the expulsion and what it produced, because the shape and the product are where the story actually lives. The immediate cause of the expulsion was an incident the Council's records call the Volkai disclosure. In year 5113, a human intelligence operative, acting under orders that were later confirmed to originate from a mid-level directorate of the Terran Assembly's Security Bureau, without the knowledge or authorization of the Assembly's senior leadership, had obtained and transmitted to the Terran Assembly's Defense Directorate a cache of classified Volkai naval tactical documents. The documents described in operational detail the Volkai fleet's contingency protocols for engagements in the Dreth Corridor, protocols that were, at the time of the disclosure, the subject of ongoing Council-mediated negotiations between the Volkai hegemony and 2 neighboring systems over corridor access rights. The Assembly's Defense Directorate had received the documents, assessed their value, and filed them. It had not used them. It had not disclosed their existence to the Council. It had not destroyed them. It had filed them and moved on, which was, in the Council's assessment, and in this historian's assessment, and in the honest internal assessment of the Assembly officials who subsequently reviewed the decision, a failure of judgment that was not criminal but was not acceptable. When the document's existence came to light, through a separate intelligence operation that the Volkai conducted and which produced evidence pointing to the Assembly's Security Bureau, the Council convened a special session. The Assembly's senior leadership, confronted with the evidence, acknowledged the incident, acknowledged the authorization failure, acknowledged the filing decision, and acknowledged that none of it should have happened. They offered a formal apology, a full accounting of the documents' handling, certification that the documents had now been destroyed, and a proposal for enhanced oversight of the Security Bureau's operations by an independent Council-affiliated body. The Council deliberated for 11 days. Its conclusion was that the apology, the accountability, and the proposed remediation were genuine and adequate as a response to what the Assembly's senior leadership had done, which was, the deliberations record reflects, relatively little. The mid-level directorate that had authorized the operation had acted outside its authority. The Defense Directorate that had received and filed the documents had made a poor judgment call. The senior leadership had not known about either until after the fact. None of this was criminal. None of it was the product of a deliberate Assembly-level decision to conduct espionage against a fellow Council member. The Council's conclusion was also that none of this mattered. Not in the sense that accountability did not matter. The Council's record is clear that it took the Assembly's accountability seriously. In the sense that the incident was, in the deliberations, framing symptomatic of something larger, a pattern of behavior by Terran Assembly personnel across multiple documented cases over the preceding 30 years, that showed a consistent tendency to treat Council protocols as frameworks to be navigated rather than commitments to be honored. The Volkai disclosure was the most recent and the most serious instance, but the deliberations record lists 14 others: minor protocol violations, information-sharing arrangements that technically complied with Council rules while systematically undermining their intent, commercial negotiations in which Assembly representatives had used procedural knowledge to obtain advantages that the other party had not anticipated and would not have consented to if they had understood the full picture. None of the 14, taken alone, would have warranted expulsion. Taken together, across 30 years, they formed a portrait that the Council's deliberation concluded was incompatible with the trust that membership required. The expulsion was, by the Council's own standard of evidence and its own stated reasoning, justified. This historian's view, formed after reviewing the full record, is that the justification was genuine and that the pattern it described was real, and also that the Council's 30-year failure to address any of the 14 incidents through its existing remediation mechanisms before the situation reached the Volkai disclosure was itself a form of institutional failure that the Council's deliberation did not examine with equal rigor. But this is the nature of expulsion proceedings. They are very good at documenting what the expelled party did wrong and less good at asking what the expelling institution contributed to the conditions that produced the wrong. The vote was 27-2. The proceeding was clean. The mess underneath it was ignored, as messes under clean proceedings tend to be. Humanity left the council chamber, or rather, did not leave the council chamber, because they had been suspended from it before the vote, and returned to the Terran Assembly's diplomatic mission station on Aurelius 7, where the delegation had been housed for 4 months while the proceedings ran their course. The delegation's head was a man named Ambassador Kofi Diallo Mensa, 63 years old, who had been the Assembly's senior council representative for 11 years, and who received the formal notification of expulsion at 8:40 hours on the 14th of session month, year 5114, while sitting at the table in the delegation's main briefing room with his senior staff around him. The notification was read aloud, by protocol, by the council's chief clerk, via a secure transmission channel that was then closed immediately after the reading, because expulsion protocol did not include a response period. Ambassador Diallo Mensa sat with the closed channel for a moment. Then he said to his staff, "All right, let us figure out what comes next." His aide's personal log from that morning records that his tone was the same as it was when he said "all right" at the beginning of any other difficult meeting. Not defiant, not shattered, steady. The kind of steady that is not the absence of feeling but the presence of a very long practice of continuing regardless. What came next was 22 years. The Terran Assembly's response to the expulsion in its public communications was measured and did not invite sympathy. The Assembly acknowledged the expulsion, acknowledged the conduct that had produced it, and stated that it intended to demonstrate through its behavior over time that the pattern the Council had identified was not the pattern the Assembly wished to be. There was no demand for reconsideration. There was no argument that the vote had been unjust. There was no appeal to the Council's procedural framework, which did include a readmission process, because the Assembly's leadership had assessed the readmission process and concluded that applying for it immediately would be understood correctly as an attempt to use procedure to avoid consequence, and that this was precisely the behavior that had contributed to the expulsion in the first place. The Assembly did 3 things in the first year after expulsion. It commissioned a full independent review of the Security Bureau's operations and organizational culture, conducted by an external body with no Assembly affiliation and with full access to all relevant records. The review took 14 months. It found, in addition to the authorization failures that had produced the Volkai disclosure, 6 other instances of operations that had exceeded authorized scope, a systemic culture within specific bureau directorates that treated protocol compliance as an obstacle management problem rather than an ethical commitment, and a pattern of middle management decision-making that had never been subjected to the kind of oversight it should have had. The review's recommendations were extensive. The Assembly implemented them completely, which took 3 years and involved the restructuring of 4 directorates, the replacement of 11 senior bureau officials, and the establishment of an independent oversight board with authority to review any security bureau operation above a specified threshold. The review's findings and the Assembly's response to them were made public in their entirety, including the findings that reflected most poorly on the Assembly. The second thing the Assembly did was contact the Volkai head Gmo. NY directly, not through council channels, which were no longer available to it, but through a private diplomatic channel that the Assembly's mission maintained with the hegemony's Foreign Affairs Office. The contact was not an attempt to manage the situation or soften the consequences. It was an acknowledgement that the Volkai had been harmed specifically and that the harm deserved a direct accounting, separate from the council proceeding. The Assembly's communication to the hegemony described, in full, every document that had been obtained, how it had been handled, what use had been made of it, and what had been destroyed. It included a detailed account of the Security Bureau's authorization failure that the council proceeding had summarized but not fully detailed. It offered no mitigation and asked for nothing in return. The Volkai's response, when it came 3 weeks later, was brief. It said, "We have read your account, we are considering it." The channel remained open. The third thing the Assembly did was the one that required the most from the most people for the longest time, and the one that produced the least visible result in the short term and the most significant result in the long term. It undertook a systematic review of every instance in the preceding 30 years in which assembly personnel had treated council protocols as frameworks to navigate rather than commitments to honor, and it traced each instance back to its origin: the decision, the culture, the institutional incentive, the unexamined assumption. And it asked for each one not just what had happened, but why it had seemed acceptable at the time to the people who had done it. This review was not public. It was internal and it was uncomfortable, and it produced findings that the Assembly's leadership found genuinely difficult to sit with. Because the findings were not primarily about bad actors, there were some bad actors, but they were not the core of the problem. The core of the problem was that the Assembly had developed, over its decades of Council membership, a specific institutional orientation toward the Council's framework. It had come to see the Council not as a community of which the Assembly was a genuine member, but as an external environment with rules that needed to be understood and managed. This orientation was not the result of malice. It was the result of the Assembly's experience of being a newer, less established member of a body dominated by older, more established ones. The same experience that had produced similar orientations in other junior member civilizations throughout the Council's history. The Assembly had learned to navigate because it had not felt fully at home, and not feeling fully at home had produced behavior that made it less at home, which had produced more navigation, and the cycle had run for 30 years without anyone examining it clearly enough to interrupt it. The internal review named this cycle. Naming it was not sufficient to break it, naming rarely is, but it was necessary, and the Assembly's leadership spent the following years building the institutional practices that might over time replace navigation with genuine membership. This is slow work. It does not produce press announcements. It does not have dramatic moments. It is the work of changing the questions an institution asks itself before it makes decisions, and changing the questions changes the decisions, and changing the decisions changes the pattern, and changing the pattern is what actually matters, and it takes as long as it takes. Meanwhile, the Council proceeded without humanity. The Council's proceedings in the years immediately following the expulsion were, by most assessments, functional. The 27 species who had voted for expulsion had done so in the genuine belief that the Council would be better without a member whose behavior had been systematically corrosive to the trust on which the body depended. They were not wrong that the corrosive behavior had been a problem. They were, several of them, privately less certain than the vote suggested about whether the expulsion was the right response. But the vote had been clean, and the clean vote had a momentum that made private uncertainty difficult to act on. What the Council discovered over the following years was something that no one had fully anticipated because the Council's models of its own operations did not include a variable for what humanity specifically contributed that other species did not. The variable was not military capacity, though humanity's military relationship with several Council members had provided indirect security benefits that were now structurally absent. It was not economic, though humanity's commercial networks had connected several Council members to trade relationships that were now more difficult to access. It was something harder to quantify, and the Council's members took longer to name it because naming it required acknowledging that the expulsion had removed something valuable, along with the problematic pattern that had justified it. The variable was what a Thresh Council delegate named Usbranvath, in a private letter to a colleague that was later published in her memoirs, called the descent function. She wrote, "I have been in this chamber for 19 years, and in that time I have noticed something that I did not expect to miss until it was gone. The humans argued, not always well, not always in ways that were comfortable to sit through. But they argued from a position that the other species in this chamber, including my own, almost never argued from, the position of someone who expected to lose the argument and was making it anyway. The rest of us argue to win or we do not argue. The humans argued because they thought something mattered regardless of whether the argument would succeed. This is an unusual thing in a governance body, and I did not know how much it moved things until it stopped happening." This is an unusual thing in a governance body. Usbranvath was describing something that the Council's formal proceedings had not measured and the expulsion deliberation had not considered: the contribution of a member who brought, to a body of older and more established civilizations, the particular quality of someone who had nothing to lose from saying what they actually thought. Humanity's junior member status, its 30 years of navigating an environment where it did not feel fully at home, had produced not only the corrosive behavior that led to the expulsion, but also something else. the habit of speaking directly about things that more comfortable members left unsaid, because more comfortable members had more to lose from the discomfort of saying them. The council had expelled the corrosive behavior and discovered that it had also expelled the directness, and the directness had been doing work that the council had not known it was depending on. The council did not immediately reinvite humanity. The council was not built for immediate reversals of clean votes, and the 22 years between the expulsion and the invitation were not wasted years, they were necessary ones. The assembly needed the time to do the work it had committed to. The council needed the time to accumulate the evidence that the work was real. The Volkai needed the time to arrive at their own assessment of whether the harm they had suffered had been genuinely addressed. These were not things that could be compressed, and the people involved on all sides understood this and did not try to compress them. The Volkai were the first to signal a shift. In year 5128, 14 years after the expulsion, the Volkai hegemony's Foreign Affairs Office contacted the assembly through the private channel that had been maintained since the first year. The contact was not an overture toward council readmission. The Volkai had no authority to make that overture, which was a matter for the council's full membership. It was something more personal and less formal, an acknowledgement that the hegemony had been observing the assembly's conduct over the 14 intervening years, that what it had observed was consistent with the account the assembly had provided of its remediation efforts, and that the hegemony considered the direct harm of the Volkai disclosure to have been adequately addressed. The hegemony was not forgiving the institutional pattern that had produced the incident. That was a matter for the council. It was saying that the specific harm it had suffered had been genuinely met, and that this was worth saying. Ambassador Diallo Mensa, who had remained the assembly's senior diplomatic representative throughout the expulsion period, and who was now 77 years old and had been doing this work for 33 years, received the Volkai communication on a Tuesday morning and read it twice. His aide, the same aide who had been with him on the morning of the expulsion and who was also older now and who had stayed, noted in her personal log that he did not say anything immediately. He looked out the window for a while, then he said, "Tell them thank you, tell them exactly that, not formally, just that." The formal readmission process began in year 5131, 17 years after the expulsion, when the Council's Readmission Review Committee received a formal petition from the Terran Assembly. The petition was accompanied by the complete public record of the Security Bureau reforms, the independent review's findings, the 14-year record of the Assembly's conduct since the expulsion, the Volkai hegemony's communication acknowledging the direct harms resolution, and a statement from the Assembly's current Director General that was 5 pages long and contained no argument for why the Council should readmit humanity. It contained only an accounting of what the Assembly had done and what it had tried to beck. And what it understood it was still working on, and a statement that the Assembly was presenting this accounting not because it believed the accounting entitled it to readmission, but because the Council deserved a complete picture from which to make its own judgment. The review committee took 18 months. Its recommendation to the full Council was positive with conditions: a 5-year probationary period with enhanced reporting requirements, a permanent independent oversight mechanism for the Security Bureau, and a formal acknowledgement from the Assembly, entered into the Council's record, of the pattern of behavior that had led to the expulsion. The Assembly accepted all 3 conditions before the full Council vote was called. The vote was 24 in favor, 5 abstentions, 0 against. The 2 species that had voted against the expulsion voted in favor of readmission. Several of the species that had voted most strongly for the expulsion voted in favor of readmission. The Volkai hegemony, which had been the most directly harmed party and whose position in the readmission vote had been watched most closely by the Council's other members, voted in favor. The formal notification of readmission was transmitted to the Assembly's diplomatic mission station on Aurelia 7 at 11:20 hours on the 6th of session month, year 5136, 22 years and 4 months after the expulsion. Ambassador Diallo Mensa had retired 3 years earlier. His successor, a woman named High Representative Ama Sarpong-Osai, received the notification in the same briefing room where Diallo Mensa had received the expulsion notice. She read it, she passed it to her senior staff. She said, "We go back in as members, not as people who are trying not to be expelled again, as members. That is the only way this means anything." The council session, at which the Assembly's representation was formally reinstated, was attended by more observers from non-member civilizations than any council session in the preceding decade. The galactic community had been watching. Not because the readmission of a single member was intrinsically significant. Members had been suspended and reinstated before, but because the 22 years between the expulsion and the invitation had been unusually visible. And what had been visible was not the kind of story the galaxy usually saw from an expelled party. Not a campaign for sympathy, not a legal challenge to the decision's legitimacy, not a maneuvering for the fastest path back in. What had been visible was, simply, the work. The slow, undramatic, unglamorous work of looking clearly at what had gone wrong and changing the conditions that had produced it. High Representative Sarpong Osai's first formal address to the Council, delivered on the day of reinstatement, was not a statement of gratitude or a declaration of reformed intent. It was a substantive contribution to the session's agenda item, a pending framework revision on interspecies intelligence sharing protocols that had been under discussion for 4 years, and was stuck on a definitional problem that no one had resolved. She had reviewed the record of the discussions before the session, identified the definitional problem, and arrived with a proposed resolution. She presented it in 12 minutes, clearly and specifically, and asked for the Council's response. The Council's response, by most accounts of those present, was a silence of approximately 4 seconds before the Thresh delegate, Usbranvoth's successor, said, "That is exactly the problem we have been stuck on. How did you arrive at that resolution?" High Representative Sarpong Osai said she had read the record and thought about it. The delegate said he had read the record too. She said she had probably read it differently because she was new and did not yet know which parts to read quickly. The chamber, by most accounts, laughed, not at her with her, and with something she had named that the chamber recognized about itself. The definitional problem was resolved in the session. The framework revision moved forward. It was a small thing. It was exactly the right size for a first day back. What the galaxy became, in the years after humanity's reinstatement, reflects everything this account has tried to document. The cost of the expulsion, the necessity of the 22 years, the value of the work done in them, and the specific contribution that humanity made to the Council's proceedings when it returned, not despite the expulsion but in a complicated way that resists clean summary, partly because of it. The assembly that returned to the Council in year 5136 was not the assembly that had been expelled in year 5114. Not because the people were different, many of them were, but people change in all organizations over 22 years. The institution was different. The questions it asked itself before decisions were different. The orientation toward the Council, as a community of which it was a genuine member rather than an external environment to be navigated, was different, and the difference was not performance. It was the residue of 22 years of genuinely trying to become something else. The Council was different too, though it would not have said so, because institutions are less prone than individuals to acknowledging how they have been changed by what they lost. Usbranvoth's successor, asked in an interview years later whether the Council was different after humanity's return than it had been during the expulsion, said, "Different is probably not the right word. Reminded, maybe. We were reminded that some kinds of friction are not the same as dysfunction. Some things that make a chamber harder to sit in are doing work." The fundamental misunderstanding of this account is the one the expulsion was built on, and it is this: that the pattern of behavior that produced the expulsion and the qualities that made humanity valuable to the Council were separable, that the Council could remove one and retain the other. This was the assumption embedded in the 27-2 vote, and it was wrong not because the expulsion was unjust, but because the qualities were not actually separable. They came from the same source. The Assembly's habit of treating Council protocols as frameworks to navigate had grown from the same root as its habit of arguing for positions it expected to lose, and its tendency to speak directly about things more comfortable members left unsaid, and its orientation toward problems as things to be solved rather than situations to be managed. The root was the experience of being new and junior and not fully at home, and continuing anyway. That experience produced the corrosive behavior and the dissent functions simultaneously, because it produced a particular way of engaging with institutions. Urgently, practically, without the comfortable assumption that the institution would naturally serve your interests, and therefore with both the temptation to shortcut and the habit of saying what you actually thought. The Council expelled the shortcut and lost the directness along with it. 22 years later, it invited both back, because the 22 years had demonstrated that the Assembly had done the work to separate them, not by eliminating the urgency or the practicality or the discomfort with complacent institutions, but by building the discipline to express those qualities without the ethical failures that had accompanied them. The work was real. The invitation acknowledged that the work was real. And both of those things, the work and the acknowledgement, were necessary for the return to mean what High Representative Sarpong Osai had said it needed to mean. Ambassador Diallo Mensa, retired, watched the reinstatement session from the public broadcast feed at his home on the Assembly's Capitol World. His aide from the expulsion period, also retired, also watching, sent him a message during the session that said only, "She is doing well." He responded with 3 words, "She always was." He had known her for 11 years before she took his role. He had recommended her to the Director General when he submitted his retirement. He had known, from the year she joined the diplomatic service, that she would be the one to bring the Assembly back in, not because she was the best diplomat he had worked with, though she was, but because she understood something that the people who had produced the expulsion had not understood, that the Council was not an obstacle to be managed. It was a community that the Assembly needed to be worthy of, and worthiness was not a status. It was a practice. You did not achieve it and then have it. You practiced it every day, and the practicing was the point, and the point never stopped being the point. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about what it means to earn your way back rather than argue your way back, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe and ring the bell because there are more stories like this one, and you do not want to miss them.